Finland boosts defense plans as Helsinki set to ease ban on nuclear weapons. Donald Trump calls on Iran to surrender unconditionally, warns U.S. attacks will intensify. And war in Iran sends crude oil prices soaring and strangles global supply, with Russia likely to be the biggest beneficiary. The ongoing dispute between Hungary and Ukraine escalated after Hungarian authorities detained 7 employees of Ukraine's state savings bank. This unprecedented event came as disagreement over the Druzhba pipeline led to sudden escalation, with Viktor Orbán looking to find traction among his potential voters ahead of Hungary's upcoming elections. Our correspondent Andrew Sweeney has the details.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's anti-EU Fidesz is behind in the polls to the pro-Europe alternative TISA, led by Peter Magyar. Orbán hopes antagonising Ukraine will burnish his image as a strongman leader.
Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister, who faces a very serious challenge from the TISA party and may lose, his leadership. He's using, basically Hungary's, stance against Ukraine, getting tough on all fronts. Hungary holding out against further EU sanctions on Russia, Hungary blocking the EU €90 billion loan to Ukraine.
The detainment of 7 employees of a Ukrainian state-owned oschadbank in Hungary en route from Austria to Ukraine has sparked outrage in Kyiv. They were reportedly transporting €80 million in cash and 9 kilograms of gold. Their lawyer said they were held on suspicion of money laundering.
This is an outrageous procedure. The embassy and indeed legal services must in all cases be allowed access to the accused. Defense lawyers must be allowed in so they can make contact with the defendant.
Ukraine's Prime Minister Yulis Fyrydenko said the action of Hungary's government were criminal in nature and may have had a political motive.
Hungary taking 7 Ukrainians hostage in a method reminiscent of 1990s-era Moscow would be a bit surprising if it hadn't come just a few days after Orbán's entourage had visited the Kremlin.
Hungary's Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó met Russian President Vladimir Putin earlier this week. Szijjártó has accused the EU of smuggling vast amounts of cash and gold to Ukraine via Hungary.
Since January, $900 million and €420 million in cash, as well as 146 kilograms of gold, have been transported across Hungary. If this is truly a transaction between banks, why was it not carried out by transfer? Why move such enormous sums in cash through our country?
Hungary is upping the pressure on Kyiv to restore the flow of Russian oil via the Druzhba pipeline ahead of general elections on April 12. Prime Minister Orbán faces a serious challenge.
His usual strategy is to single out a few enemies. The number one enemy is Ukraine.
Orbán is reportedly receiving support from a team of Russian agents linked to the country's foreign intelligence agency, the GRU, to run election interference. He's received endorsements from both Putin and US President Donald Trump. The irony of accusing Ukraine of election interference has raised eyebrows in Warsaw.
To get electoral support simultaneously from MAGA and GRU is no mean feat, but is Viktor Orbán fighting for Hungarian sovereignty or volunteering to make it a condominium?
With the 7 Ukrainian detainees set to return home, the only question now remains is this: what's happened to the enormous sums of cash and gold? For TVP World, Andrew Sweeney.
As the conflict between Ukraine and Hungary deepens, what is the European Union's response? Where do officials in Brussels stand in relation to the latest developments with Hungary blocking a €90 billion loan for an embattled Ukraine? We are now joined by our reporter in Brussels, Laura Hazanov, who has more. Good evening, Laura. So the spat between Ukraine and Hungary deepens, as we can see. What is the response from EU officials regarding the latest escalation? What can you tell us?
Hello. Well, it's been not much publicly so far. I've reached out to a couple of Commission spokespeople for comment, but so far it's been radio silence. It certainly seems that the whole situation has become quite a bit of a headache here in the European capital. As you've rightfully said, Ukraine and the European Commission has been trying very hard to secure a €90 billion loan for Ukraine. That loan is currently being blocked by Hungary, who say that their support for those funds is entirely contingent on Ukraine unblocking the Druzhba pipeline, a pipeline that is notorious for supplying Hungary with Russian oil. And it really begs the question, with the EU trying so hard to secure Orbán's backing and let those funds flow through, but with the current escalation, how feasible is that? I've asked our expert Tomasz Włostowski for his comment.
It seems to me like both Orbán and Zelenskyy are calculating on an escalation. I think the Commission is underplaying the likelihood that Zelenskyy actually is just not going to rebuild the pipeline. And also Ukraine is probably counting on the fact that this money is going to be found one way or another, even without Orbán's explicit support. I think there are also calculations that maybe Ukraine is not under such a financial constraint as it was previously believed. So maybe Ukraine can survive until the elections and see what happens after the elections.
Well, it definitely seems the predicament isn't going away anytime soon. But of course, if there's anything new, I will keep you updated. Back to you in the studio, Claudia.
Thank you so much. That was Laura Hazanov reporting live from Brussels. With conflict simmering around the globe, Finland is ready to amend its legislation to allow the distribution of nuclear weapons across the country. As the threat from Russia looms and France offers a helping hand in sharing its instruments of nuclear deterrence, Finland might move to accept a nuclear sharing program. Piotr Miszczuk has the details.
This is the border between the world's largest nuclear power, Russia, and nuclear baron, Finland. The Finns are now fed up with the looming Russian threat to their country's security.
The government's proposal is that bringing nuclear explosives into Finland, transporting, delivering or possessing them in Finland would be made possible in the future if it were related to Finland's military defense.
This policy change elicited a fresh threat from the Kremlin.
The fact is that by deploying nuclear weapons on its territory, Finland is beginning to threaten us, and if Finland threatens us, we take appropriate measures.
The nuclear topic has come to the fore amid simmering global conflicts, including the latest one in Iran.
The Secretary General said the threats of nuclear weapon is the highest in decades.
But Iran, despite its efforts at enriching uranium to weapons-grade levels, still doesn't have its own nuclear arms. 9 countries have independent arsenals and another 6 merely host foreign nukes, with Russia and the US controlling nearly 90% of the world's nuclear warheads. All key nuclear powers are currently working on further developing their nuclear programs.
The United States is likely to build up. France has already said that it will build up. Great Britain is likely to build up. Yes, also Russia might. Yes, and obviously China is already building up.
The issue has been picked up by French President Emmanuel Macron, who announced France would increase the number of its warheads to extend its nuclear umbrella across Europe.
And beyond our British and German partners, and friends already mentioned, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Sweden and Denmark will be joining the initiative.
This was well received across the region, but the US voiced opposition to the idea.
I think we'd more than try to talk them out of it. We'd obviously, at a minimum, strenuously oppose it. It's hypothetical, but we're against such an eventuality.
Given that France and Britain's nuclear arsenal wouldn't be enough to deter Russia, the nuclear sharing program with the US is key for Europe's security architecture.
I don't expect that nuclear sharing will be terminated. It might even expand to more countries. There has been a very quiet kind of discussion in NATO about stationing American nuclear weapons in Poland and Romania.
Though top Polish officials have voiced their interest in hosting US nuclear weapons on Polish territory, so far there have been no changes in this regard. But NATO-wide nuclear deterrence still remains the backbone of the alliance.
The preventive deterrence provided by NATO membership, including nuclear deterrence, was a very important factor in Finland's decision to join NATO.
For TVP World, I'm Piotr Miszczuk.
The only satisfactory end to the war in Iran for U.S. President Donald Trump is Iran's unconditional surrender. But with no clear end to the strikes in sight, there is growing concern of the conflict taking Trump's attention away from the war in Ukraine. Kazimierz Łysiak has more on the latest from Iran in this next report.
Another day of U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran and Lebanon. And in the Oval Office, a moment of prayer.
Continue blessing and favor to rest upon him.
You want to see me do it again?
In stark contrast to official communication from the White House, which used a children's cartoon to celebrate successful attacks.
You want to see me do it again?
The question now is, what is the end goal for the United States? President Trump says unconditional surrender.
There will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. After that and the selection of a great and acceptable leader, we and many of our wonderful and very brave allies and partners will work tirelessly to bring Iran back from the brink of destruction.
I think the president's having a heck of a say in who runs Iran, given the ongoing operation we have. So there's no expansion in our objectives. We know exactly what we're trying to achieve.
The United States and Israel have so far eliminated most of the Iranian regime's top command, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. But then again, the Ayatollahs have often been compared to the multi-headed Hydra for a reason.
But Iran is not Syria under Bashar al-Assad, a one-man show. And when you get rid of this man, everything is being solved. The Iranian regime has backing from within some sectors of the Iranian population.
The regime also enjoys the backing of its biggest ally, Russia. According to the Washington Post, Moscow has been providing Iran with intelligence where to strike U.S. targets. Still, Russia remains mostly preoccupied with its invasion of Ukraine.
Even if Iran asked Russia for help, Russia would not be able to assist its ally because Putin is very busy in Ukraine. The world has to be reminded, especially Russian allies, that with friends like Putin, they do not need any enemy.
The two conflicts becoming increasingly intertwined by their political, military and economic consequences. The United States has asked Kyiv for help in intercepting Iranian Shahed drones, the same killing machines that have wreaked havoc in Ukraine for the past 4 years.
The U.S. has a shortage of those interceptors if this is a protracted conflict. So it's also political, of course, though, because it's callous showing the U.S. in particular, look, Ukraine can contribute here to your military when we need you to contribute to European and Ukrainian security.
That sentiment echoed by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Help us stop our war and we will help you. And yet European officials are concerned that Trump's already shifted his interest to the Middle East.
Yes, the worry is there that it's diverting attention away.
Or other distractions. For TVP World, Kazimierz Łysiak.
As the Gulf conflict deepens, oil prices are once again soaring, sending energy markets into a frenzy as Brent crude value increased by more than 20% this week, a record since April 2024. With the Strait of Hormuz closed, Asian buyers such as India and China could turn to Russian crude for supplies, giving the Russian energy sector an unexpected boost. Maciej Wilowski reports.
In the span of only a week, the war in the Middle East has sent energy markets into a tailspin. The price of Brent crude, the global benchmark for oil prices, spiked nearly 30% this week to the highest level since November 2022. It was also the biggest one-week gain in 4 years since Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine.
The energy market is currently navigating a perfect storm. Since February 28th, we've witnessed massive risk premium being backed into every barrel.
In an effort to bring down prices, the U.S. on Friday offered India, a major oil importing country, a 30-day waiver on purchases of Russian crude.
The decision to grant this waiver was simply to draw down oil prices. The conflict with Iran obviously has raised energy prices with the Strait of Hormuz under threat. And this is an attempt to move the needle downwards by allowing illicit Russian oil to be offloaded to India.
As of 2024, roughly 37% of India's crude oil imports came from Russia, up from less than 1% before the latter's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But a majority share of India's crude oil and natural gas imports came from the Middle East, particularly Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Much of that fuel passed through the Strait of Hormuz, now largely cut off due to the war between the US, Israel, and Iran.
India is particularly exposed, given its roughly 45-50% reliance on Persian Gulf for crude. Every dollar increase in oil prices adds billions to India's annual import bill.
With the Strait of Hormuz largely offline, energy importers, particularly in Asia, will seek their oil elsewhere. And one country could capitalize more than others, Russia.
Hormuz crisis is a massive tailwind for the Kremlin. With Gulf supplies offline, Asian refineries, Asian buyers essentially are forced back into the Russian crude.
As a further boost to the Kremlin, the U.S. waiver on Russian crude bound for India directly undercuts Western sanctions on Russia.
This completely undermines sanctions on not just Russia, but even Iran. And it also undermines U.S. sanctions.
Ironically, the attack on Iran, a key Russian ally in the Middle East, could offer Russia the biggest boost to its energy sector and state finances in years. For TVP World, I'm Maciej Wilowski.
Kosovo will have to host parliamentary snap elections for the third time in just over a year after President Vjosa Osmani dissolved the assembly. The reason? The Kosovo government was unable to reach a consensus on selecting the new head of state. Could the political crisis in Kosovo continue to spiral? Our Balkans correspondent Paweł Trzaskowski has the details.
I have decided to dissolve the assembly and announce the date of new elections after consultations that I will hold with the political parties.
And with that being said, Kosovo will hold snap parliamentary elections for the third time in just over a year. After the vote in February last year, the assembly had to dissolve, having failed to form a government. The December snap elections did produce a government, but the assembly was unable to choose a new president. So, according to the constitution, it had to be dissolved.
Of course, the citizens did not want new elections. The situation was created by the assembly's failure to carry out its constitutional duty.
In Kosovo, the president is elected indirectly by the assembly no later than 30 days before the end of the sitting president's term. The deadline was Thursday midnight, but the required quorum was not reached, a calculated move from the opposition, according to some analysts.
The opposition decided not to come to the vote, knowing fully well that this would lead to new elections.
The opposition is challenging the rule of the Vetvendosie party. Victorious in last elections, it was able to form a majority government led by Prime Minister Albin Kurti. But since larger consensus is needed to elect the new president, the country is now back to square one.
I was also thinking, there is no interest in new elections on any side of the party, so they will find a compromise. But apparently the polarization is very great. I don't see that anybody really wins from this, especially not Kosovo as a state.
Vjosa Osmani, who was not tipped by Prime Minister Kurti as a candidate for a second term, will continue as acting president until the new parliament comes to an agreement. And the political crisis in Kosovo might continue to spiral. If the parliament fails to form a government again or does not elect a president, it will be dissolved once more. Paweł Trzaskowski, TVP World.
As the situation in the Gulf is escalating beyond a point of return, the effects of the conflict are seen beyond the Middle East. To talk about the latest and the far-reaching effects of the storm in the Gulf, I'm joined by Joshua Bergen, founder of Alliance for Global Security. Good evening. Thank you for joining me on the program.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure as always. So President Donald Trump said there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. He also continued, quote, "We and many of our wonderful and very brave allies and partners will work tirelessly to bring Iran back from the brink of destruction." This all sounds quite optimistic, but what plan do you think Donald Trump has for Iran?
Well, it's clear that the president gave them an ultimatum, negotiated, laid down a line on taking advantage or attacking their citizens, and when they crossed it, he ultimately took an action. This is going to have far-reaching repercussions, remaking the Middle East, remaking the world in some senses, as most acknowledge that what's happening there has more to do with China and perhaps even Russia than even Iran itself. Whether the president has a plan for what happens once the action is done, that remains to be seen. I think the general mode is that looking for people within Iran to take up the reins and lead.
Mm-hmm. We also heard from Pete Hegseth, who said, quote, "The president has a heck of a say in who runs Iran." Do you have any suggestions of who could possibly President Donald Trump be eyeing for that position?
Well, I certainly think the legacy family that looks to return has some stake in this, in an interim role. No doubt the administration has tools in its arsenal, both in terms of intelligence apparatus, other relationships that have been built through U.S. programming for many years, even diaspora living in the United States. There's many diaspora in the United States who have Persian, Iranian backgrounds that carry language, cultural skills, and can move into that space and provide a future round of leadership for the country. And I suspect there's homegrown as well. The administration doesn't need to solve these problems today.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, according to a report by the Washington Post, Russia is actually providing Iran with targeting information to attack American forces in the Middle East. Do you think that this is the only extent Russia is willing to go in that conflict, or are we going to see more perhaps?
Well, I think we're watching both the Iranian leadership, much of which doesn't exist anymore, as well as Russian leadership, and to a lesser extent the Chinese, looking at this as existential. Russia has been in an ongoing war with Ukraine, highly dependent on Iran, and frankly speaking, it would shock me if they weren't providing targeting information. What Russia stands to lose by lack of access to Shahed drones, they don't need the energy and oil as much as China does, but there's resources that have enabled them to project power throughout the region that's been offered by Iran, and that looks to be off the table for them for the foreseeable future. Not surprising at all. If we take this a step further, there is not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that there's an existential contest for which mode of leadership is going to rule the world and foreign affairs over the next 100 years. The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans line up on one side and have increasingly collaborated like we haven't seen since World War II, and the rest of the messy family of democracies with all their varying political processes, structures, traditions, and norms that have to then agree. The United States continues to be the world's largest single economy and single military, and to that end, it does, just by the very right of that, have a larger stake in the game and the outcomes.
So I mentioned previously here that we know that President Trump said that there will be no deal with Iran, but apart from unconditional surrender. Meanwhile, we also heard from Russia's Alexander Dugin, who said if Iran falls, Russia is next. Is Russia next then?
There's nothing that I have seen or heard over the past years that caused me to think that anybody in the West, either in Europe or the United States, want to see Russia doomed in the same way as Iran. But Russia continues to provoke the world in what I think to be very negative and bad ways. It has surprised me, actually, that Europe, who has consistently talked about strategic autonomy, has not placed 50,000 troops on a rotating basis, 200,000 in total, fighting side by side with their Ukrainian brothers, solving logistical problems, infrastructure problems, transportation problems, manufacturing problems along the way, while gaining a meaningful military, a meaningfully experienced military. And I frankly think that European leadership could have been saying along the way, Russia will decide if you remain intact once this is over. No one has ever done anything that suggests that, and I've never heard a credible voice in Washington saying that they want to see Russia broken up. But I do suspect that if we continue down the road that Russia's going, and they refuse to take an olive branch, at some point it may well be as Dugin is suggesting.
Mm-hmm. Ukraine is involved with Hungary and a spat over the oil deliveries via the Druzhba pipeline, with reports of Ukrainian bankers having been detained and then released. Do you think that this situation will play in Ukraine's favor, or perhaps it'll hinder its efforts, especially when we look at a broader picture of having that 90 billion euro loan that is still being blocked by Hungary, and a multitude, actually, of other factors?
Well, we've all been following that news overnight. Clearly, Orbán is playing for his own political life. He's been in power now for the better part of 2 decades. It looks like, the Hungarians are looking for new leadership, and he is playing for keeps because he knows that his job is on the line. I think that the money involved, while it's $80 million, can't be sneezed at. I frankly think this is a bit of a sideshow. Yes, Ukraine has been arm wrestling with Hungary to join with their fellow European nations and relying on energy sources elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Russian administration, through the Kenyan embassy, released a video over the Christmas holidays in which Ded Moroz Putin was handing favorable energy contracts to Orbán. As I pointed to earlier, there's an existential contest taking place around the world. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and subsidiaries. And unfortunately, Orbán has chosen to line up on that side. Does that mean that he's lined up fully, that Hungary is not part of the European Union? Absolutely not. The Hungarians themselves have things to say, and I think are preparing to make their voice heard on his leadership. But I do think it's troubling that a key president in Europe continues to play games with Russia, and frankly is enabling Russia with propaganda. I mean, the whole outcome this morning with the film of the back of the van, the gold bars, the money. This is clearly made for television propaganda that's aligned around his presidential campaign, and the Russians are sparing no opportunity to exploit it.
How does it reflect on the U.S. and Donald Trump, President Donald Trump in particular, the fact that he's supporting Orbán ahead of the April elections? Meanwhile, we have Moscow also supporting Viktor Orbán. You mentioned this existential crisis. How does this play into the full picture?
So I knew you were going to ask this question, and it's a fair one. It's even a good one.
Thank you.
Nation states must be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And certainly this administration has interests around traditional values, around immigration, around other topics that go beyond pure security. And I suspect that's as much at play around Orbán as anything else. I don't know what's in the head of the administration exactly. I cannot predict or say, but I suspect it falls more along the notion of some of the other issues that exist on the table within Europe than merely the security questions. I think Orbán is making it increasingly difficult for probably the White House to maintain that degree of support, whether overt or implied. And to that end, it would be, in my view, in Orbán's interest to come in line with the rest of Europe, as opposed to continuing to play footsie with Russia on these topic areas. Where Orbán stands in terms of traditional conservative values, in sort of family sizes, etc. These are other matters that I don't think at the end of the day have as much legs as he might think they do.
We also heard over the last few days that the trilateral peace talks between Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S. are on hold due to the war between Washington and Tehran. Do you think we are actually running a risk of Donald Trump's desire to finish this conflict to finish this war between Ukraine and Russia quickly, regardless of possible outcomes? Do you think that Ukraine could be actually facing that danger?
From where I stand, no. I'm sure some voices would say otherwise. Ukraine has consistently held up against a country that was supposed to roll over it in the space of 3 days to 3 weeks. I don't see Ukraine backing down from its demands. We've seen headlines in the last days of the U.S. looking to Ukraine's expertise on drones to counter some of the things that they're facing in Iran. Ukraine has, with the price of blood, earned credibility and earned experience with their drone technologies that the rest of the world would do well to seek their guidance from. Far too many Western contractors looking at big dollar payouts where Ukraine has real cards to play. I don't think there's any question around this. And I think because of the cards it has to play, the idea that the administration is seeking to use Iran or other activities to jam through an end of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I don't think it's realistic. I think there's much more to play out there, and I personally have not seen the end of the war between Russia and Ukraine for at least another year to 18 months.
In fact, Washington actually spoke to Kyiv about a possibility of using the anti-drone technology, considering the conflict in the Middle East. So we will be seeing definitely more discussion in days and weeks to come. Joshua, thank you so much for joining me on World News Tonight. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me tonight.
That was Joshua Bergen, founder of Alliance for Global Security. And so this would be all the latest news for now. Thank you for joining me. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more news and features. But until then, good night.